The knock on my door came on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after we buried Harold, and when I opened it to find a man in an expensive suit holding a leather briefcase, my first thought was that someone had made a terrible mistake. My second thought, which came immediately after and with considerably more force, was that whatever this man wanted, it couldn't possibly have anything to do with me. People in expensive suits with leather briefcases didn't come to doors like mine, didn't stand on porches like this one, didn't look for women like me with their careful, assessing eyes and their practiced smiles that revealed nothing. My name is Cecelia James, and I want you to stay with me through this entire story, because I promise you that what happened after that knock will change the way you think about kindness, about assumptions, about the quiet dignity of people the world decides aren't worth noticing. Subscribe to this channel right now if you haven't already, and leave a comment telling me your name and what city you're watching from, because this story is for all of us who have ever been overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed. This is my truth, and I'm going to tell it to you from the very beginning, so you understand exactly how I got to that Tuesday morning and why that knock on my door shattered and rebuilt me at the same time. I grew up in Meridian, Mississippi, the third of 6 children born to parents who worked themselves to the bone every single day of their lives and still couldn't quite make the ends meet. My father drove a delivery truck for 32 years for a company that gave him a pen and a handshake when he retired. No pension, no benefits, just a ballpoint pen with their logo on it that he kept in a drawer by his bed until the day he died. My mother cleaned houses, which is how I know how to do it properly, how to get into corners and under baseboards and behind toilets in ways that most people never bother with. She taught me that there was dignity in every kind of work, that the measure of a person wasn't what they did, but how they did it, and that showing up when you said you would was worth more than almost anything else in the world. I took those lessons with me when I moved to Savannah, Georgia, at the age of 24, following a man named David James who promised me a different life and delivered, for about 3 years, something that resembled one. We had a small house in a working-class neighborhood, 2 children in quick succession, a rhythm of living that felt almost comfortable if you didn't look too closely at the cracks. David worked construction when he felt like it, which wasn't as often as you'd think, and I worked at a laundry facility downtown, feeding sheets and tablecloths through industrial mangles 8 hours a day, coming home with hands so chapped they bled in winter. When David left, he left completely. No forwarding address, no child support, no explanation beyond a note on the kitchen table that said he needed to find himself, which I thought was a remarkably selfish thing to write to a woman with a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old and $43 in the checking account. I sat with that note for about 10 minutes. Then I folded it up and put it in the trash and started figuring out how to survive. This is where the story really begins. Not with the dramatic knock on my door, not with Harold's funeral, not with the lawyer in the expensive suit. It begins with survival, with the particular kind of resourcefulness that gets bred into you when you have no other choice, when there's no safety net below you, and falling isn't an option because there are two small faces depending on you to stay upright. I started cleaning houses. It was what I knew, what my mother had taught me, and it was work I could schedule around my children's school hours. Work I could do without a degree or a resume or references from jobs I'd barely held. I built my client list slowly, one recommendation at a time, one satisfied customer telling another, and within 2 years I had enough steady clients to leave the laundry facility and clean houses full-time. Most of my clients were in the nicer neighborhoods, the historic district and the islands, women with beautiful homes and complicated feelings about the women they hired to clean them. I learned to be invisible in those houses, to move through them like water, leaving everything cleaner and more ordered without drawing attention to myself. Some of my clients were genuinely kind. Others were the kind of kind that comes with conditions, that requires gratitude and deference in return. I learned to navigate both, learned when to smile and when to stay quiet, learned the particular arithmetic of working for people who had more than you and knew it. My children, Marcus and Destiny, grew up watching me work. I made sure they understood what I was building, that there was no shame in what I did, that hard work and honesty were the foundation of everything. Marcus was serious and focused, got good grades, had his father's height and his grandmother's work ethic. Destiny was fiercer, quicker to anger, quicker to laugh, the kind of child who made you tired and grateful in equal measure. I raised them in that small house in the working-class neighborhood, not the same one David and I had shared, but one I rented on my own, and we were okay. Not comfortable, not secure in any way that let me sleep soundly every night, but okay. Harold Whitfield came into my life 8 years after David left. On a Tuesday morning in March, when I knocked on the door of a house on Gaston Street that I'd been referred to by another client. The house was a Victorian, one of those beautiful old Savannah homes with wraparound porches and tall windows and bones that spoke of better days. From the outside, it looked like it needed work, the paint peeling, the porch railing loose in 2 places, the garden overgrown in a way that spoke of neglect rather than intention. The man who answered the door was small and thin, somewhere in his late 70s, I guessed, with white hair that needed cutting and clothes that had been good once, a long time ago. He looked at me over the top of reading glasses with the expression of someone who'd forgot they'd made an appointment. "Mrs. James," he said, his voice carrying the rounded vowels of old Georgia money. "Yes, sir. You called about cleaning services." He studied me for a moment with sharp blue eyes that were considerably more alert than the rest of him suggested. "I did. Come in, come in." The inside of the house took my breath away, but not in the way you might think. It wasn't beautiful, not anymore. It was a house that had been magnificent once and was now in a state of slow, sad decline, dust thick on surfaces that had clearly once been treasured. Stacks of newspapers and books on every available surface, kitchen cabinets filmed with grease, bathrooms that made me wince with professional disapproval. But underneath all of it, you could see what it had been. The bones of the house were extraordinary. The moldings were hand-carved, the floors were heart pine, the windows were original wavy glass that cast patterns of light across the dusty surfaces. "It's gotten away from me," Harold said simply, watching me take it all in. "My wife kept it. Eleanor. She died 4 years ago, and I'm afraid I haven't managed particularly well since." The honesty of that statement, the simple, unself-conscious admission of grief and inadequacy, did something to me. I'd heard 1,000 explanations from clients about why their houses needed cleaning, most of them tinged with embarrassment or defensiveness. This was neither. This was just a man telling the truth. "I can help with that," I said. We agreed on a rate, which was lower than I usually charged, because the house was clearly going to take significant effort just to bring up to baseline. Harold seemed relieved and grateful in a way that made me think he'd been worried I'd say no, or maybe that he'd had to work up courage to call at all. I found out later that he'd gotten my number from his neighbor Agnes, who'd been a client of mine for 3 years, and that he'd kept the number in his wallet for 2 months before finally calling. The first day I cleaned Harold's house took me 8 hours. 8 solid hours of work that left me exhausted in my bones, but also strangely satisfied. The way you feel when you've done something that genuinely needed doing. I cleaned room by room, moving the stacks of newspapers and books carefully, because I quickly understood that they weren't random clutter, but organized in ways that had meaning to Harold, organized by some system I didn't understand but instinctively respected. I didn't throw anything away. I dusted and mopped and scrubbed, and by the time I left at 4 in the afternoon, the house smelled of clean and polish instead of dust and neglect. Harold was waiting in the kitchen when I finished, 2 cups of tea already poured, and he gestured to the chair across from him with an expression that made it clear this was not optional. "Sit," he said. "Please." I sat, though I was acutely aware of my dirty knees and chapped hands, of the contrast between me and the room, between me and this man with his careful manners and his faded gentility. "You didn't move my papers," he said. "No, sir, they looked organized." "They are. Nobody else has ever noticed that." I wrapped my hands around the warm cup. I figured if they mattered enough to keep, they mattered enough to leave where you put them. He looked at me for a long moment, that alert assessment in his blue eyes. "Eleanor would have liked you," he said finally. That was the beginning of something I didn't have a name for at the time, something that developed slowly over months and then years, something that I've spent a lot of time since trying to describe accurately. Harold Whitfield became my client, yes, but he became other things too. He became a kind of anchor in my week, a fixed point I looked forward to in ways I didn't fully acknowledge even to myself. I came every Tuesday morning, and every Tuesday morning there was tea waiting, and after a while there was conversation too, real conversation, not the polite employer-employee exchange I had with most clients, but something more substantive. Harold was a retired history professor from Savannah College of Art and Design, I learned. He'd written 4 books on Southern history, none of them bestsellers, but all of them, he told me with dry amusement, still in print. He and Eleanor had been married for 51 years, had raised 2 sons, both of whom had moved away and called infrequently. He had opinions about everything, strong opinions delivered gently, and he had a way of asking questions that made you feel like your answers actually mattered. He asked about my children, and I told him. He asked about my work, and I told him. He asked about my plans, my dreams, my reading, and I found myself telling him things I hadn't said out loud to anyone. Things about wanting to send Marcus and Destiny to college, about how I was saving money in an account I never touched, about how I read a book every 2 weeks from the library because it was free and because it was mine. An hour with a book that belonged entirely to me and no one else. He started lending me books. First cautiously, testing, handing me a worn paperback at the end of a Tuesday visit with the air of someone making an offering they weren't sure would be accepted. Then more regularly, with comments attached, recommendations and context, the habits of a lifelong teacher emerging when least expected. I read everything he gave me and returned each book with my honest opinion, which Harold seemed to find delightful regardless of whether I agreed with his assessment. "You have a good mind," he told me once, about 18 months into our arrangement. "Have you ever thought about going back to school?" I laughed, not unkindly. "When would I do that?" "At night. Online, there are programs." "Harold, I work 6 days a week to keep my children fed and my rent paid. There isn't night left over." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "When Marcus is in college, then, when things ease up a little." It was the first time anyone had spoken about my future as if it was a real and manageable thing, as if it existed and was worth planning for. I drove home that Tuesday crying in my car, which I'd never done before and haven't done in quite that way since. This is the point in the story where I need to tell you about the other thing that was happening, the thing that ran alongside the Tuesday mornings and the tea and the books, the thing that I'm almost ashamed to tell you even now. Because alongside all that warmth and genuine connection, there was a reality about my situation with Harold that I sometimes found painful and occasionally found humiliating. And I think you need to understand that to understand the full truth of what I'm telling you. Harold was, by every external measure, a poor old man. His house needed constant maintenance I couldn't provide because cleaning was my job, not repairs. His clothes were old and worn. He ate simply, shopping at the discount grocery store 3 blocks from his house. And I know this because I could see the store brand cans in his cabinets. His car, an ancient Volvo with a cracked dashboard and a driver's side door that only opened from the outside, sat in his driveway most weeks unmoved. He didn't seem to have money for any of the things the house needed, didn't paint the exterior, didn't fix the porch railing, didn't replace the washing machine when it started running noisily until it gave up entirely one December. And yet he paid me every Tuesday exactly what we'd agreed, in cash, from an envelope he kept in the kitchen drawer. Never late, never short, never accompanied by the vague promises or excuse-making I sometimes got from clients who were stretched too thin. Whatever Harold had, he paid me first. About 2 years in, I stopped charging him for the extra hour I was spending each week. The house had reached a point of equilibrium and didn't need 8 hours anymore, but there was always something extra to do, something Harold couldn't manage on his own, a high shelf that needed dusting, a window that needed washing, the slow creep of entropy that old houses resist in their own particular way. I did the extra hour because it needed doing, and because I couldn't charge him for it without it feeling wrong, and because somewhere along the way I'd stopped thinking about Harold's house as a job and started thinking about it the way you think about the home of someone you care about. My clients found out eventually, not because I told them, but because Agnes next door mentioned it to someone, and Savannah is a small city in the ways that matter, and it got back to me within a month that people were talking. The specific shape of the talk, which reached me through the careful social architecture that connects the women who clean houses and the women who hire them, was this: Cecelia James is cleaning that old man's house for free because he's got no money. Isn't that sweet? Isn't that just like her? The "isn't that just like her" was the part that stung. It was the part that said I was the kind of woman who worked for free because she was too soft to insist on being paid, too poor herself to afford generosity, but giving it anyway out of some reflexive compulsion to serve. It painted me as simple, as well-meaning but not particularly wise, as the kind of person who gave without thinking about what she was giving or what she was losing. I told myself it didn't matter what people thought. I told myself that what happened between me and Harold in that kitchen on Tuesday mornings was no one's business and no one's to evaluate. But the truth is that it did sting, that it planted a seed of doubt in me that sometimes grew thorny at night when I was tired and the bills were tight and I thought about the extra hour every week, which added up to 52 hours a year, which was more than a full week of work I was donating to a man who, however much I cared about him, was not my family and had not asked for my charity. I never said any of this to Harold. How could I? The dynamic of what we were to each other didn't allow for me to sit across that kitchen table and say, "I've been thinking about the money, Harold." Instead, I just kept showing up every Tuesday morning, kept drinking my tea, kept having my conversations, kept doing my extra hour, and kept pushing the doubt down to a place where it couldn't do too much damage. My children knew Harold, had been to the house a handful of times over the years, and they had complicated feelings about the situation. Marcus was careful with his words about it, diplomatic in the way he'd always been, saying things like he seems like a good person, Mom, and it's good that he has someone looking out for him. Destiny was less diplomatic. Destiny, at 19, told me flatly that I was being taken advantage of and that kindness was one thing, but being a fool was another, and she hoped I knew the difference. I told her I wasn't being a fool. I told her I knew exactly what I was doing. But her words had more thorn than Marcus's careful diplomacy, and they caught in me in the way that things said with love and frustration sometimes do. Harold turned 82 the winter before he died. I brought him a card and a jar of the watermelon rind preserves I made every summer, his favorite, and he opened the card at the kitchen table and read it with the careful attention he gave everything, and then looked up at me with those sharp blue eyes and said, "You've been the best part of my Tuesdays for 6 years, Cecelia. I want you to know that." I told him he'd been the best part of mine too, and meant it completely, and we drank our tea and talked about the book I'd just finished, A History of the Low-Country Rice Economy, that he'd recommended 3 weeks earlier. And it was an ordinary Tuesday morning, and I didn't know it was going to be one of the last ones. He had a stroke in February on a Wednesday, which meant I didn't know about it until the following Tuesday when I arrived and found the house dark and Agnes coming out of her front door with the particular expression of someone who has bad news to deliver. She told me Harold was in the hospital, that his son Robert had been called down from Charlotte, that it didn't look good. I drove to the hospital and sat in the waiting room for 2 hours before a nurse told me that only family was being seen, and I drove home with my hands tight on the steering wheel and something crumbling quietly inside me. He came home 3 weeks later, diminished in ways that made my heart ache to see, moving more slowly, speaking more carefully, some of the sharpness in his eyes replaced by something cloudier and more effortful. His son Robert had been there when he came home, a man I met briefly in the hallway, tall with his father's blue eyes and none of his father's warmth, who looked at me with the polite blankness of someone cataloging information they don't quite know what to do with. "You're the cleaning woman," he said. Not unkindly, just matter-of-factly, the way you'd say you're the plumber or you're the mail carrier. Accurate, categorical, placing me precisely in my role without a millimeter of ambiguity. "I clean for your father, yes," I said. He nodded, pulled out his phone. "Dad's going to need more help now than just cleaning. I've been looking into some options. We'll let you know about the schedule going forward." I waited for Harold to say something, to introduce me as more than the cleaning woman, to offer some context for what our Tuesday mornings actually were. But Harold was tired, leaning against the door frame with his eyes half closed, and didn't seem to register the exchange at all. I drove home feeling something I haven't been able to fully name since, something between grief and erasure, the particular pain of watching yourself reduced to a function in the eyes of someone who doesn't know you, but feels entitled to define you. Robert went back to Charlotte after 2 weeks, having arranged for a home health aide named Benita to come in on Mondays and Thursdays. He called me to say I should continue my Tuesday arrangement, that Dad had been clear about that, which was how I found out that Harold had specifically requested my Tuesday visits continue, which meant Harold had been clearer in his conversations with Robert than Robert had been with me. I kept coming. The house had changed, had the particular atmosphere of a place that is being managed now rather than lived in. The home health supplies visible on the bathroom counter, the grab bars newly installed, the kitchen rearranged for easier access. Harold was less himself in those final months, more tired, more distant, occasionally confused in ways that were new and frightening. But on some Tuesdays, for stretches of an hour or two, he was entirely himself, sharp and present and engaged, and those stretches felt more precious because of their rarity. One Tuesday in early October, about 8 months after his stroke, Harold took my hand across the kitchen table and said, "Cecelia, I need you to know that I see you. Everything you've done here, everything you are, I see it." I told him I knew he did. "I want you to trust me," he said. "Can you do that?" I told him I already did. He died on a Saturday in November, quietly, in his own bed, which was what he'd wanted. Benita found him in the morning and called Robert, and Robert called Agnes, and Agnes called me. I sat in my kitchen for a long time after that call, not crying, just sitting with the particular weight of losing someone who'd been a fixed point in your life for years, whose presence you'd stopped noticing the way you stop noticing the furniture until the day it's gone and the room looks entirely wrong. I went to the funeral because, of course, I went to the funeral, and I sat in the back of the church in my good dress, the navy one I'd bought 3 years ago for my cousin's wedding. And I listened to Robert speak about his father with the careful, competent emotion of a man fulfilling an obligation. And I watched the other people there, former colleagues and neighbors and people from the historical society Harold had belonged to, and I thought about all the Tuesday mornings that none of these people knew about. All the conversations and books and cups of tea that existed in a space separate from Harold's public life. After the service, Robert shook my hand briefly and thanked me for my service to his father, which was the exact phrasing he used, "Your service to my father," and I smiled and said Harold had been a wonderful man and I would miss him. And Robert nodded and moved on to the next person in the line of condolences. The drive home from Harold's funeral was one of the longest I can remember, though it was only 12 minutes by the clock. I went over every Tuesday morning, every book, every cup of tea, every conversation about my children and his books and the history he loved so completely. I thought about 6 years of showing up, about the extra hour every week, about Destiny's voice saying, "I hope you know the difference between kindness and being a fool." And I thought about Robert's phrase, "Your service to my father," which reduced 6 years of Tuesday mornings to a transaction, which made me a function rather than a person in Harold's life. I wasn't angry at Harold. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't angry at Harold at all. But I was sad in a way that had some anger threaded through it, sad that the world reduced what we'd had to what it could easily categorize, sad that I'd go home to my house and Harold's would be sold, and there would be no record anywhere of what those Tuesday mornings had been. 3 days after the funeral, on a Tuesday morning as it happened, there was a knock on my door. The man on my porch was somewhere in his late 50s, silver-haired, with the careful grooming and good posture of someone who'd spent a lot of his life being taken seriously. His suit was charcoal gray and clearly expensive. His shoes were polished. His briefcase was leather, the real kind, and he held it with the easy familiarity of someone who carried one every day. "Mrs. Cecelia James?" he said. "Yes. My name is William Garrett. I'm an attorney with Garrett and Associates." He handed me a card. I was Mr. Harold Whitfield's attorney and the executor of his estate. I wonder if I might speak with you. I looked at the card for a moment, then at the man, then back at the card. My first thought, as I said, was that someone had made a mistake. My second was that I needed to stay calm and find out what this was before I let myself feel anything about it. "Come in," I said. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd eaten 1,000 meals with my children, and he set his briefcase on the floor beside his chair and folded his hands on the table with the practiced patience of a man who did difficult things professionally. "Mrs. James," he said, "I'll get straight to the point. Harold Whitfield passed away last Saturday, as you know, and I am here today in my capacity as executor of his estate to inform you of certain provisions in his will that directly concern you." I sat very still. My hands were in my lap. Outside, I could hear a car going down the street and the distant sound of someone's leaf blower. Mr. Whitfield's estate is more extensive than perhaps you were aware, Mr. Garrett continued carefully. Over the course of his lifetime, Mr. Whitfield made a number of investments that, over time, accumulated to a significant value. He was, in some ways, a private man about his financial situation. I was starting to understand what he was saying and not saying, and the understanding was arriving in pieces, each one larger than the last, each one requiring me to revise something I thought I knew. "How significant?" I said, because I needed to hear it plainly. Mr. Garrett opened his briefcase and withdrew a document. Mr. Whitfield's estate, after taxes and specified bequests to his sons and certain charitable organizations, has a remaining value of approximately $4.7 million. The leaf blower outside went quiet. In the silence, I could hear my own breathing. "He had $4.7 million, I said. "After other distributions, yes. He was a careful and successful investor, Mrs. James, and he was also, as you may know, a man of very modest personal habits. He didn't spend much. $4.7 million. The man who shopped at the discount grocery store 3 blocks from his house. The man whose washing machine gave out one December and sat broken for 6 months. The man everyone called a poor old man, including me, quietly, in my thoughts, though I'd never said it aloud. The man whose house I'd cleaned for less than I should have because I thought he couldn't afford more. "Why are you here?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand that too. Mr. Garrett slid the document across the table. "Mr. Whitfield has left you a bequest, Mrs. James. Specifically, he has left you the house on Gaston Street, which has been independently appraised at $850,000, along with a cash bequest of $1 million. I looked at the document without reading it. The words on the page were moving in ways that made it difficult to focus. "He also left a letter," Mr. Garrett said, producing an envelope. "He asked that I deliver it personally." I took the envelope. My name was on the front in Harold's handwriting, careful and slightly shaky, the handwriting of his later years. I didn't open it immediately. I set it on the table in front of me and pressed my hand flat against it, as if I could absorb its contents through my palm. "There's one more thing," Mr. Garrett said, and something in his tone made me look up. Mr. Whitfield was aware that the terms of his will might come as a surprise. He asked me to specifically note, for the record, that this bequest was not an impulsive decision, but one he'd thought about carefully for a long time. The will was drafted 5 years ago and has remained unchanged since. 5 years ago. Which meant that 3 years into our Tuesday mornings, Harold had decided to leave me almost $2 million worth of property and cash. 3 years in, when I was still figuring out what we were to each other, when I was still carrying the doubt that destiny had named and I'd pushed down, when I was cleaning his house for less than I should have because I thought he was struggling. After Mr. Garrett left, after I'd signed the documents I needed to sign, and received the information I needed to receive, and sat for another 20 minutes in a silence that seemed to have physical weight, I opened Harold's letter. It was 4 pages, handwritten, dated 18 months earlier, which meant he'd written it after his stroke, which meant he'd written it knowing the end was coming and wanting to make sure certain things were said. He began by telling me what I'd meant to him, not in vague emotional terms, but specifically, carefully, in the way of a man who'd spent his life working with language and understood its precision. He talked about the Tuesday mornings, about the tea, about the books. He talked about watching me over 6 years and seeing someone of extraordinary character, someone who worked without complaint, who treated his home with respect and care, who engaged with ideas with a genuine and curious mind. He talked about Alina, about how she'd always said that the measure of a person was how they treated people who couldn't do anything for them, and how I had passed that test every single Tuesday morning for 6 years. He told me he knew what people said, that they thought he was a poor old man and that I was cleaning his house out of charity. And he said he'd let it be because he was a private person, and because, honestly, he'd found it interesting to see who I was when I didn't know I was being observed, whether I was genuine or whether I was performing generosity for an audience. That sentence stopped me for a long time. I had to put the letter down and walk to the window and look out at the street before I could go back to it. He wrote that I'd been genuine every single time, that the extra hour I'd started doing, which he'd noticed the first week and never commented on, had told him everything he needed to know about my character. That the books I'd read and returned with honest opinions, the conversations we'd had about my children and my dreams, the way I'd sat across from him and treated him like a person with something worth saying rather than an old man to be managed, all of it had added up to something he wanted to honor. He wrote that he knew the house needed significant repairs and that the money was partly to address that, but mostly it was because he'd watched me work for years toward a future for my children, and he wanted to give that future a foundation. He'd been paying attention, he wrote, when I talked about Marcus and Destiny, about the college fund, about the things I wanted for them. He'd been paying attention the whole time. He ended the letter with a line that I've read so many times since that I could recite it in my sleep. He wrote, "The world will try to tell you what you are, Cecelia. Don't let it. I've watched you for 6 years and I know exactly what you are, a person of uncommon worth, and I am grateful every day that you knocked on my door." I sat with that letter for a very long time. The emotions arrived in waves, grief first, and then something like joy, and then a complicated gratitude mixed with something that needed several minutes to identify as shame. Shame for the doubt. Shame for the nights I'd thought about the extra hour and resented it, even slightly. Shame for accepting the world's designation of Harold as a poor old man and letting that designation color my understanding of the situation. And then something else. Something larger and harder to name than shame or gratitude or grief. Something that had to do with being seen, not categorized or defined or reduced to a function, but genuinely seen, over 6 years of Tuesday mornings, by a sharp-eyed man with a lifetime of practice watching people closely. I called Marcus first. He was at work, and I could hear the particular quality of his voice that meant he was trying not to show emotion in a public space. I read him the part of the letter about uncommon worth, and I heard him exhale, long and unsteady, And he said Mom and didn't say anything else for a moment, and that was enough. I called Destiny second. Destiny, who had told me I should know the difference between kindness and being a fool. Destiny was quiet for a long time after I told her, and then she said, in a voice that was smaller than her usual voice, I didn't understand. And I said, I know, baby. Neither did I. What happened in the months after that Tuesday morning was not simple or clean or uncomplicated, because real things rarely are. There was paperwork and legal processes, and a conversation with Robert Whitfield that was deeply uncomfortable on both sides. Robert clearly having known about the will and feeling something about it that he was too careful to say directly. Me feeling the accumulated weight of your service to my father in a new context. Robert was not cruel about it. He was stiff and formal and slightly wounded in the way of a man who'd expected to receive more and hadn't, which was his right. Harold's money was Harold's to give as he chose. But he wasn't cruel, and he asked me once, in the midst of the legal process, what his father had been like in those Tuesday morning conversations, and I told him honestly and in detail and watched something move across his face that might have been regret. The house on Gaston Street needed work. Significant work, which was why the cash bequest mattered as much as the property. I hired contractors, good ones, and I oversaw the renovation with the particular care of someone who knows houses from the inside out, who understands the difference between cosmetic improvement and structural repair. I kept everything that was worth keeping. The heart pine floors, the hand-carved moldings, the original windows with their wavy glass that cast those patterns of light. I moved in 8 months after Harold died, on a Tuesday morning in July, carrying boxes through the front door of a house I'd cleaned for 6 years and now owned. Marcus and Destiny both came to help, and Agnes from next door brought food, and we sat on the repaired porch in the evening with the old Victorian street stretching out before us, and I thought about Harold saying a leaner would have liked me, and I thought he was probably right. I kept cleaning houses. People asked me why, assumed I'd stop, assumed that coming into that kind of money meant I'd leave behind the work I'd been doing. But I'd learned something important from Harold about the dignity of continuing to show up, about how what you do is less important than who you are while you do it, and I wasn't ready to become someone who'd forgotten where she came from just because her circumstances had changed. I did change some things. I raised my rates. I became selective about my clients, keeping the ones I genuinely liked and letting go of the ones who made me feel like a function rather than a person. I started taking 1 day a week to do something that was entirely mine, to read or garden or simply sit on Harold's porch, on my porch now, in the morning light with a cup of tea, and think about things worth thinking about. I enrolled in an online program, a degree in history that took me 3 years to complete while working, because Harold had suggested it, and because it turned out I was hungry for it in a way I'd been suppressing for years. I graduated on a Thursday morning, and Marcus and Destiny came, and I wore the same navy dress I'd worn to Harold's funeral, and I thought about that being right somehow, that the dress should carry both of those days. I used some of the money to start a scholarship fund at Savannah State University, small but real, for students who were the first in their families to attend college. I called it the Whitfield James Scholarship because both names needed to be on it, because both of us had made it possible. Harold with his money and his careful watching, me with my Tuesday mornings and my extra hour and my willingness to keep showing up. There's a moment I come back to often when I think about this whole story, a moment I haven't told anyone until now. About 4 years into my Tuesday mornings with Harold, on a late spring day when the wisteria on his back fence was blooming and the whole yard smelled of it, Harold said something to me that I didn't fully understand at the time. We were sitting in the kitchen with our tea, and he was quiet for a while, and then he said, "You know what I've noticed about you, Cecelia? You never ask for more than you're owed, not once in 4 years." I told him I thought that was just how you were supposed to behave. He shook his head. "No," he said, "most people are always calculating, always looking for an angle. You just do the work and you do it honestly and you let that be enough. Do you know how rare that is?" I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. "Don't let the world teach you that's a weakness," he said then, and went back to his tea. I didn't understand what he meant until I was sitting at my kitchen table with his letter in my hands and Mr. Garrett's card on the table, and the knowledge of $4.7 million reorganizing everything I thought I'd understood. He hadn't been observing me passively all those years. He'd been making a decision, slowly and carefully, the way he made all his decisions, about what to do with what he had and who deserved to be trusted with it. He'd been watching me not ask for more than I was owed. And he'd decided, on my behalf, that I was owed more than I'd ever asked for. 5 years have passed since Mr. Garrett knocked on my door. I'm sitting on the porch of the house on Gaston Street writing this, and the wisteria Harold's Aliner planted on the back fence is in bloom again, and the street is quiet in the way of Tuesday mornings in Savannah in the spring. Marcus finished his engineering degree and works in Atlanta, calling every Sunday without fail. Destiny is in her 2nd year of law school, fierce and focused, going to make someone answer for something someday. The house is beautiful. I have made it beautiful, carefully, over these years, respecting what it was while making it what it needed to be. The neighbors know me now, know who I am and how I came to be here, and most of them have been kind about it in the genuine way rather than the conditional way. I still think about what people thought when I was cleaning Harold's house for what they believed was less than I should have charged, what they said about me being simple and soft-hearted and not knowing the difference. And I think about what Harold was actually doing all that time, watching carefully, making his quiet decision, leaving me a letter that said things nobody had ever said to me before or since. The world will try to tell you what you are. Don't let it. That's the lesson of the Tuesday mornings. That's the lesson of 6 years of tea and books and an extra hour every week. The world will categorize you and reduce you and define you by what it can see from the outside, by your work and your neighborhood and the car you drive. It will decide what you're worth based on what you charge and what you own and who opens the door for you at fancy events. It will call a brilliant man a poor old man because his paint is peeling and his washing machine is broken, and it can't see past the surface of things to the extraordinary life being lived inside. And it will call a woman simple and soft-hearted for giving more than she's asked to give, not understanding that the giving isn't weakness or naivety, but character. The steady, unglamorous expression of who you actually are when nobody's watching. Somebody was watching. Harold was watching. And what he saw was worth, he decided, almost $2 million and a 4-page letter and 6 years of Tuesday morning conversations that I think about every single day. If you've made it to the end of this story, if you've stayed with me through all of it, I want you to know that I see you too. All of you who give more than you're asked to give, who show up without applause, who do the work honestly and let that be enough. I see you. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Leave me a comment with your name and the city you're watching from. Tell me about someone in your life who saw you when the world didn't, or tell me about the extra hour you've been giving somewhere that you haven't been able to explain to yourself or anyone else. Because those extra hours are who you are. They're the truest thing about you. And somewhere, someone is paying attention. My name is Cecelia James. I live in Savannah, Georgia. And every Tuesday morning, I sit on my porch with a cup of tea and I think about a man who looked at a cleaning woman and saw something worth 4 pages of careful, honest words, and I try to be worthy of it. Go be worthy of whatever someone sees in you. Go give your extra hour somewhere it matters. Go be the person who shows up quietly without waiting for recognition and trusts that the right eyes are watching. That's all. That's the whole story. That's everything Harold taught me on 100, and something Tuesday mornings in a house that smelled of old books and dust, and eventually of clean.